Hello, and welcome to another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen. I'm John Charles, and I'm thrilled, and the Poison Pen is honored to have with us today author Mia P Manansala. Did I get that correctly?
Manansala.
Manansala, I apologize, whose new book is Homicide and Halo-Halo. The Poison Pen does have copies of Mia's new book, as well as the first in the series, Arsenic and Adobo. And if you'd like to have us hold a copy or put one in the mail for you, feel free to give us a call or go online, and we would be happy to do that. And now I would like to welcome Mia.
Thanks for having me.
We're delighted you could be here. Let's start by having you begin by telling us a little bit about yourself before you became a writer. Who was Mia?
Well, Mia was, I was always a reader as a child. My love for mystery started really young, probably with the Encyclopedia Brown series.
Oh, I love those.
A lot, a common question people what is the book that you remember kind of defining your childhood or made you think of being a writer? And a book that always stood out to me is Encyclopedia Brown Takes the Cake, which oddly enough it involves recipes. It was, as a kid, I was like, oh, cool. I get the puzzle of solving a mystery, and then I flip it over, find the answer, get some recipes. So, from a very young age, obviously culinary cozies were something that I was into. Mm-hmm. I always loved writing, but I kind of didn't really think of it as a viable career for myself. Even though I studied English in college, that was more for teaching and that kind of thing.
You did some kind of interesting things. You worked in, was it South Korea?
Yeah, for 3.5 years, I was English language instructor in South Korea. Oh. And then, me coming home from that, because, I was having a wonderful time. I was learning a lot about myself, but, life continues. And, people, the people I cared about back home, their lives went on, there were some medical scares, people getting, and I started missing out on people's lives. So I came back, and then I felt a little stagnant. I had all these things here, and now I'm back home living with my family, doing the same thing I always did. And that's when I remembered how much I loved writing. And I thought, why don't I do something for myself? And I took my very first creative writing class in 2015, which happened to be a mystery writing class. And it was taught by Lori Rader Day. And I always love to shout her out by name, because I fully credit her with making me feel like I could do it, making me, helping me become part of the crime fiction community. Because she read what I wrote in class that day, and she was like, "This is your first time? I think you've got something here. I think you're a mystery writer." And she welcomed me into the fold. And so that's where it all began.
And as you were kind of making that journey toward publication, you got some pretty significant recognition. You won a number of awards, including the Eleanor Taylor Bland Crime Fiction Writers of Color Award. Did those kind of help push you into the publication venue?
Not necessarily with publishing, but with some recognition, I would say. So because Arsenic and Adobo it's that the early chapters are what won the Eleanor Taylor Bland Award. But I also had a book before that won the Malice Domestic William F. Deek grant. And that is the book that I credit with really having me fully join the crime fiction community. Because that's the book I started in Lori's class. That's the book that led me to meeting the author who'd become my mentor, Kelly Garrett, another wonderful crime writer of color. And even though that book ultimately didn't get published, it taught me so much about the industry, about craft, and who I wanted to be as a writer. It even got me my first agent. Ultimately, it didn't work out. So after 1.5 years of rejections, I moved, I spent that time writing the book that would become Arsenic and Adobo, and that's the one that got picked up for publication.
Tell us a little bit about that first book and your character, Lila.
Yeah, well, both. So that's actually something in the that's in the book, which is, I think, somewhat common for people whose names are what we think of as a traditional anglicized names, but are often pronounced in in my family the Filipino way. So I kind of because I got the idea when someone actually asked me oh, is it pronounced Lila or Lila? And it didn't even occur to me that people would have that question. And I realized how common that would be, particularly with other Filipinos reading this. because my younger brother has the same issue. Like my whole life, I've always called him Nolan, Nolan. But in school and other, America, like they're like, his name is Nolan. And I'm
Mm.
like, who's Nolan? But that's the name he uses outside of the family.
Mm.
And so I figured that would be a similar thing for my character of Lila, who was born and raised in the US, but grew up in an immigrant family. So like it's like a little nuance that I wanted to kind of include in there.
Mhm.
So sorry, that was a little bit off topic, but
No,
so
that's fine.
yeah, Lila Macapagal, she's a young 25-year-old Filipino American woman who grew up in a small fictional Midwestern town known as Shady Palms, Illinois. And she's kind of a big fish in a small pond is her mentality at the beginning of the book. She always thought she would move, to the big city and make big things happen for herself. But when she catches her fiance cheating on her and her life kind of falls apart because her life in Chicago was kind of centered around him and his friends, she kind of runs back to her hometown to lick her wounds and heal. And in the process, she's kind of tasked with helping to save her aunt's failing restaurant, where she runs into her high school boyfriend. But because it's a murder mystery and not like a cute rom-com,
Mhm.
it's not a second chance at love. He's the town's vindictive food critic, and he has been trying to get the restaurant shut down for some time. And so one day, mid-meal, mid-review, he passes out and dies, and she becomes the main suspect.
Now you mentioned these are definitely mysteries, but there is that element of romantic comedy, and I believe
Mhm.
you kind of see the cozy mystery, the mystery genre through the prism of rom-com a
Mhm.
little bit. Can you kind of explain your theory of that?
So yeah, I mentioned my mentor earlier. So Kelly Garrett, we're pretty good friends. We talk all the time. And one day we were talking about the contemporary cozies we had been reading because we both really love the cozy, subgenre.
Mm.
And she pointed out that a lot of the ones she'd been reading had a lot of similar tropes to what we see in romantic comedy movies.
Mhm.
So she was like, like it's always like a young woman, right? It's never a
Mhm.
man, and it's a young, mid-20s, maybe
Mhm.
early 40s, that kind of range. Almost always a small town, if not a small town, a small community,
Mhm.
who leaves and comes back and is usually tasked with like saving the family business or trying to reinvigorate the town's something. um and we just kind of started joking about how contemporary cozies are kind of like rom-coms with dead bodies.
Yeah. Well, and usually the protagonist is either recently widowed or they've just
Mhm.
had a bad breakup or something,
Yeah,
so they're
yeah, unlucky
available.
in love in some way, yeah.
Yeah.
And so I really wanted to play with that, especially because a lot of people are not necessarily like, unless you are like a heavy mystery reader, not many people that I know are familiar with the cozy mystery genre. So when
Mm.
they try to have me explain like what it's murder but funny,
Mhm.
like I'm like,
Yeah.
it's kind of like a Hallmark movie but with dead bodies, and like that somehow like clicks in their head. They're like, oh, I know what it is you write. So like I'm kind of joking, but I'm also kind of serious when I
Sure.
say that.
So that was the first book that introduced readers to your character, and now we have Homicide and Halo-Halo, which to me kind of read like a very fun mashup of Murder, She Wrote and Miss Congeniality.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the story?
Oh, I'm so glad you thought that, because like again, Murder She Wrote, again, part of like my early mystery upbringing, I grew up in a multi-generational household like my protagonist. So I grew up with my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, parents, etc. So I grew up watching Murder She Wrote, Matlock, Perry Mason,
Mhm.
which is, I kind of wanted like that kind of fun,
Mhm.
but like with a twist in my book. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
So Homicide and Halo-Halo, it takes place a few months after Arsenic and Adobo. And again, like most cozies, they're technically standalones. You could pick it up, never having read the first one, and understand it. But there will be like a deeper understanding of Lila's character. Because in this book, she's still dealing with the issues from book one.
Mhm.
And the town's beauty pageant has been reinstated, and it's bringing up a lot of like uncomfortable feelings in her and her, due to connections to her past. The rivalry that's been stoked between her and her cousin pretty much her whole life. And then, of course, wouldn't you know it, the head judge gets murdered and her cousin becomes the main suspect. So she's again dragged into this world, almost kicking and screaming.
Mhm.
while having to deal with all the other issues in her life. Again, events of book one, opening a new business, possibilities of romance, things like that.
And what I loved about your series, as with many other mystery series, is learning about something, in this case, the Filipino culture. And you had written in the book, if you wanted to draw a large Filipino crowd, the surest way to do it, outside of a karaoke, of course, was to have a viewing party for a beauty pageant, a baseball game, or a boxing match. Are beauty pageants really that big a deal with the Filipinos?
They are a huge, so that's actually how I started. Again, like, it's a comment like, oh, why a beauty pageant? So like, my joke answer is that, oh, what do small town USA and the Philippines have in common? Oh, they love beauty pageants. So, but this is something I grew up knowing about. Like, I was never personally involved, but even my mom, who cares very little for fashion and that kind of thing, loves watching them. And
Hmm.
so many of the other families that we knew growing up watched it too. So, in my head, I was like, what is it? Like, lots of people love beauty pageants, but it seemed almost like an obsession, like a huge cultural phenomenon in the Philippines. And I was like, what is it about beauty pageants that, that are so important? And so, like, I actually started doing research into that to try to get into that mentality of like, how can I mine this for a book? And I touch on it lightly in here because, again, it's just supposed to be a background thing. It's supposed to be mostly about the murder, obviously. But in the Philippines, beauty queens are held up on a pedestal, almost like activists. You are expected to go back into the community and do good. Like, so each beauty queen has their issue, shall we
Mhm.
say, like their agenda that they want to try and improve. Because
Mhm.
for many of them, particularly the ones who are born into poverty,
Mhm.
beauty pageants are the one way for them to rise up, because they really are technically scholarship programs.
Mhm.
So in the book, Lila's mother, our protagonist's mother, is a deceased beauty queen. And
Mhm.
she was born and raised in one of the poorest areas in the Philippines, which is where actually my maternal grandmother is from. And so, her winning was a huge deal. It pulled her out, she was able to move to the US, but for her, it went no further, right? So, it was big things, and it was a wonderful change, but then kind of went stagnant for her. And so she started pushing her expectations onto her daughter, which is part of Lila's issue in this book.
I think you do a very good job about kind of bringing the beauty pageant into the 21st century, because as you noted, they're not, just beauty pageants. They're a way
Mhm.
for young women and to kind of get a foot up on their
Mhm.
career, on college, on all those different things. So you have someone who's kind of making changes to the Shady Palms teenage beauty pageant.
Mhm. Yeah, again, when I was younger, it was so easy to dismiss it, like, oh, it's so like vapid or shallow or this or that. But that was speaking from a place of privilege, because like these, a lot. I mean, sure, some of them, that's what they care about is the limelight. But for some of these, and again, I made sure to make a good mix of the character. Well, hopefully, hopefully a good mix of the characters. There are people who are like, this is their only chance to go to college. Like, if they truly want to go to college and fulfill their dreams, like, they can't really, that this is their best chance
Yeah.
to get the money they need.
As a reader, one of Lila's favorite romance tropes is the love triangle. And to some degree, you've incorporated that in the series. Can you talk a little bit about that angle to the character?
Sure. So again, this was something that kind of rose organically. So again, like when I first started Arsenic and Adobo, like, so the whole first page is just me playing with those tropes, right? Just kind of poking fun, because I love romance and I love cozy. So it's like, it's not me insulting,
Mm.
it's me having fun with these. And when I first started, I originally didn't have like a love triangle planned. I just, I knew there was a love interest because, again, I was playing on those tropes, but it wasn't an initial idea of mine, because I didn't really know how to write it. But as I was developing other characters in the world, trying to expand it and make it feel real and lived in, there was a particular character who went from being background to like more and more important. And then I was just like, oh, if I'm playing with these tropes, why not fit in a love triangle? Because then again, those are also somewhat common in cozy mysteries as well. Like, a lot of times we'll see our protagonist torn between, like, I don't know, the detective versus like the average guy,
Mhm.
who's there for her, or, which is not quite what I did here, but like, I'm like, okay, there's precedent for this. So
Both food and family play an important role in your series. Can you talk a little bit about why these two elements are so important to you as a writer?
I mean, because they're so important to me as a person. I think so. For me, I'm Filipino American, but I was born and raised in Chicago. And unlike my protagonist Lila, I didn't have a large Filipino community growing up with. For me, my ties to my background and my ties to my family are kind of interwoven. Like I can't separate them. And one of the few tangible things that I feel like connects us all is food. So food is like it's a universal. We all need to eat. Most, not everyone necessarily has a positive experience with food, but most of us kind of get the general connection of like community and family and culture. But for me specifically, I think food is such an interesting thing to include in my writing because it's not just, I mean, yes, I spend, lots of descriptions to make it sound tantalizing. And I love people telling me that it sounds, it makes them hungry. But I also hope they see some of the nuance and the layers where I can use food for backstory, which I did in the second book regarding this chicken dish that her mom used to make for when she was younger.
Yeah.
Right? Because food and scent can play with memory. So, it's character, it's backstory, it's relationships, it's history, it's politics. It can mean so many different things for so many different people. And particularly in this series, food means love. And so like I really wanted to kind of infuse that in my writing.
You do an excellent job. For those that aren't familiar with Filipino cuisine, can you tell us a little bit about it? In the second book, Halo-Halo plays an important kind of role in the story. So kind of give us a tour of Filipino food.
Sure. So that's always one of those things that's really hard to define because the Philippines is an archipelago of like, I want to say like over 7,000 islands. So there are obviously like regional variations. But for these, especially for the first couple of books, I wanted to choose ones that I knew we were considered more like national dishes. So for book one, arsenic and adobo is technically like our national dish. And it's more like a style of cooking than one, because you can use various proteins, right? So chicken is probably the most well-known, but there's also pork and shrimp and vegetable. And so it's, and again, even though it's like, this is the adobo that I know, there's gonna be others. So almost always the versions that I'm familiar with contain soy sauce, vinegar, garlic, and bay leaf. And that's another reason I wanted to include it, because I include recipes. I really want people who are not familiar with Filipino food to give it a try, because some ingredients are a little bit hard to source, right? If you're not, but I'm like soy sauce, vinegar, garlic, bay leaf. Okay, like in general, most chain grocery stores would have those. Like that's a really good place to start. Halo-Halo is it literally means mix, because it's like it's kind of like an ice cream sundae parfait shaved ice kind of concoction, right? Because book two takes place in summertime, which is a little awkward trying to advertise in the middle of February when it's like below freezing and snowing in Chicago, but we'll persist. And in general, it has like shaved ice, sweet beans, lots of fruits. Sometimes it's top, so it's like a lot of things, and it can kind of be like, so at the parties that I went to growing up, it would almost be like a halo bar. You can kind of like if you've ever gone to like a yogurt place where you can kind of choose all the toppings, it would be very similar. Like you would get your base of like shaved ice, and then you can put whatever toppings you want, and then it's usually topped with maybe evaporated milk. If you're lactose intolerant, coconut milk is a pretty good alternative, things like that. And it's the variety of things that kind of make it interesting.
Now, in this series, Lila is opening her business with her friends, and she's the baker, and she kind of puts a spin on Filipino sweet treats because she takes traditional things and then maybe it's a little bit of herself, her American heritage into them. Can you talk about that? Was that something you yourself do at home? Do you practice these recipes? Is this like a trend in baking? And talk about that aspect.
Well, so for me, I've always enjoyed baking, and I thought it would be really fun to incorporate like ingredients that we traditionally think of as Filipino and put them into what bakes that we think of as American, or kind of vice versa. And so I've seen there are there are a few here in Chicago that are doing like more contemporary Filipino stuff, but most of them are in like California or like very, very far from where I am here in the Chicagoland area. So if I want to taste these like delightful creations I see on Instagram, I'm like, well, why don't I give it a try? And so I thought, oh, that's probably where she started as well, because the idea of, again, as food as love, like that's something that I do. So before times, I was still an English language instructor, and I would bake every week for my coworkers and students. And so I was always trying out recipes and trying out new things. And I felt like, oh, Lila would probably do that too. If she's really stressed with school, yeah, she's gonna bake brownies for like her, her college friends, and things like that. And then wanting them to look like pretty. So like, like ube is a purple yam. And so it photographs really beautifully. And it's like, oh, why don't I start incorporating these other parts of my heritage? And like, that's kind of how I came up with that idea for her. And yeah, the creating the recipes, because all of the recipes are ones that I create. Like I do research, I kind of cobble things together and I make them my own. That's probably my favorite part, because it's like, oh, I'm not procrastinating making this giant cake. No, it's clearly research for this book I'm working
on. Your books have been kind of marketed and described as cozy mysteries. How would you define a cozy mystery, and what do you think are the key ingredients you need for it to be successful?
So the only thing that I think most of us can kind of agree on is that cozy mysteries usually do not have graphic sex, violence, or bad language or swearing on the page. But with that last one, what's considered bad language is so variable to people. So I would say, the first two definitely, I mean, most of us can agree on that. Like, I guess there's like no F-bombs or anything like that. Everything else is kind of up for debate.
Well,
Other than that,
don't you kind of switch up the OMG phrase a little bit?
Oh yeah, oh my god, yes, because like, oh my gulay means it's one of those things where like if you directly translate it, it's like, oh my vegetables, but because you want that OMG kind of thing. So because a lot of people who are particularly religious, in Christianity, feel like taking the name of, that they don't want to say the name of the Lord and take it in vain. So she grew up in a very Catholic family. So for her, she naturally watches her language, particularly because she's, around her aunt and grandmother all the time. So she has to come up with more creative, not excellent, but things to exclaim. So that's one of them.
I know in cozy mysteries, as in other genres, there's kind of an author has to walk this fine line between the willing suspension of disbelief on the part of a reader and the real world. And I think you do a really good job about that in this series, especially when it comes to Lila and how she deals with the effect of a murder in the second book, because it's not treated as just, an ordinary day in that little town. It does have effects, but you do it organically within the definition of a cozy mystery. Can you talk a little bit about walking that line as an author?
Oh, thank you, because it's so tough, because again, like I love cozy mystery. That's why I wanted to start. That's why I wanted to write my own. It's my mom's favorite genre. We read them together. But it was one of those things where it did kind of bother me that there was almost like no progression or character development or even acknowledgement that like, wow, this is so weird, that's 10th body in this, and again, I get that you kind of have to, because you're trying to keep it light, the psychological effects of like that much stuff, and just, an average citizen, obviously I can't play too much into that. But at least for the first one, I felt like that's the one, if there's going to be an impact, it's going to be after the first one, because that's when her entire life has changed. I really gave it to her, like she's dealing with a breakup and trying to save her aunt's business, and she's a murder suspect, and now she's, like her life isn't. So with book two, especially because it's only a few months later, because as most cozies are, like there's not years in between. I felt like for me to pretend nothing happened and she can just sweep it all under the rug and move forward, does a disservice to the character and eventually the audience, because I feel like mental health is something that's like not really touched on enough in certain things like that. And book two deals a lot with that, not just again the effects, but also from not dealing with things from her past and you know, trying to just push things down and keep, you know, pretend everything is fine. So I want the realism of life to be there, but I also wanted people to go in knowing justice will be done at the end. There is going to be a happy ending. There's still lightness in all the dark things that she deals with, right? There's still jokes and stuff. Yeah. But cozies are still crime fiction. And I feel like if you are not examining some of the issues of real life, again, you're doing a disservice to well, I shouldn't say disservice, but you know, people write for different reasons. I feel like you are maybe not exploring as much as you can, shall we say.
If someone were to come to you, a reader who's new to cozy mysteries, and said, who should I read? Who are some of the better examples in the genre? What books or authors would you steer them to?
Ooh, I lean obviously very heavy, you know, culinary. So I really love the Vivian Chan Noodle Shop mysteries. Yeah. I'm a little bit behind, but is it Barbara Ross? She has like the main clam bake mysteries.
The lobster ones, yeah.
Yeah. There is, if you want like a non-food one, I do read non-food books. VM Burns has a mystery bookshop series, yeah, which is really fun because you get two mysteries in one, because the protagonist is a mystery bookshop owner, but a aspiring writer. So you get the modern day mystery that she's dealing with in real life, as well as the historical England mystery that's like woven throughout, as like to like kind of like break it up. So it's very, very fun. Who else? If you want something that's like a little bit closer to mine, again, the idea of an edgy cozy is so silly to me, but this is how, you know, it's kind of what we're seeing. So like, I mentioned Kelly Garrett earlier, her Detective by Day series, Olivia Black, Killer Content.
Yeah.
A very like updated, you know, using social media kind of a thing.
I guess you'd call it a millennial cozy.
Yeah, millennial, yeah, very much so. Oh dang. It's one of those things where like I have so many and I'm
all those names and they're not coming to you right away.
Yeah, but those are definitely some really great places to start.
Let's talk a little bit about what your own writing process is like. When you're writing a mystery, most people assume that the author has to know everything that's going on because there is the puzzle, there is the mystery that's at the heart of the story. But authors actually approach that in different ways. How do you approach writing a book? So for me, because I'm writing a series and they, you know, get published fairly close together, you know, about 9 months or so apart, I need to, I am an outliner. But for me, what I pay attention to are like the big beats, the heavy movements. Like, so I know some people who will have 13, 20, 25 page outlines where they know every single thing in every single chapter. And that's not me. I know how it begins. I know the structures that hold it up, and I know how it ends. And, you know, some of those things in the in between may change, you know, because as I try to be very character driven. In the past, I've done it where like I said, this thing happens, I already figured it out. Why aren't you working? And that, you know, the square peg round hole kind of a thing. And, you know, and you could, when in my writing, at least I can tell when I'm forcing a situation instead of letting it happen naturally. So, you know, I plan ahead so that I know at least, you know, I'm like, oh man, I'm really stuck. Well, I know I have to make it to this point. So as long as I make it to this point, then, you know, that kind of a thing. But how I get there, I allow myself to kind of imagine and play and let my characters, you know, talk to me as much as possible and guide me. When you're not writing, what do you do to keep yourself entertained? I know you mentioned baking, but I was fascinated to discover there's something called JRPG, which I had no idea what was. So. It's an acronym for Japanese role-playing games. So I'm a gamer. I like to play video games. I also at the beginning of the like my, you know, everyone kind of has like a pandemic hobby. I thought mine would be gardening. That didn't take. I thought it would be knitting. That also didn't take. But
But a friend of mine started a D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, but it's virtual. So like we don't have to gather in person. We can all, it's a great way to have socializing,
Yeah.
without having to actually get together in person. So it's wonderful because, it's basically storytelling, it's storytelling in a game setting, but there's no real stakes, right? Like, so I get to flex the creative storytelling side that I love, socialize with people, and just kind of like not take things seriously. It's like, oh, it's not like a book that has a deadline. It's just like, oh, I made a bad decision, well, I guess I have to create a new character because that one died. Oops. So yeah, I try to make my hobbies creatively fulfilling, but not only book related.
What's next for you as an author, if you don't mind sharing?
So I have been very lucky. So book 3 in the series comes out in October, Blackmail and Bibinka. Bibinka is a rice cake that's traditionally sold at Christmas time because book 3 takes place around Christmas time. So I'm very excited about that one. Book 2 was a struggle. Book 3 was difficult, but there was a lot of fun to it. So I was like, oh, thank goodness, writing can be fun again. And also Berkeley, my publisher, has purchased the next 3 books in the series. So there will be up to at least 6 books in the Tita Rosie's Kitchen Mystery series. And book 4, titled Murder and Mammon, comes out sometime in 2023. We're not sure the exact date yet.
That's wonderful. I'm delighted that there'll be more. How can readers learn more about you and your books? Do you have a favorite social media platform?
Yes, so I'm most often on Twitter. But I also occasionally post on Instagram. My handle is the same across Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. It's at MPM the writer. So my initials, MPM the writer. You could also sign up for my newsletter on my website. Every month I give recipes, book recommendations, occasionally giveaways, and talk about like how my writing is going and things like that. So my website, it's just my full name, miapmanansala.com.
Well, I can't believe how quickly our time has flown by. It's just been a delight chatting with you, Mia. Thank you for writing such amazing books, such wonderfully entertaining stories. I'm thrilled there'll be more coming. Thank those of you tuning in and listening, and please feel free to either purchase a copy of Mia's book from us or at your favorite independent bookstore. And I'd like to thank Mia for joining us for another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen Bookstore.
Yeah, thank you. Again, this was just it flew by. It felt very natural. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for tuning in.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.